Okay, so this is the second recording, which follows on the first one of this SketchUp model diagram being created. However, it works on yours, and hopefully you have the diagram that you took. You've drawn out, basically a layout, and then you've taken it in SketchUp by now and kind of created a massing model that helps explain it. In addition, using this view, the isometric scale that's not in perspective is helpful, and also providing this kind of black and white line drawing style exported to PDF is what we're hoping you guys can do. So the next step, right, would be to go into Adobe Illustrator. You should have Creative Cloud on the computer labs at school. You can also get it for about, if you go to the KU IT Technology Store, you can actually purchase a license for $10, which lasts you for the year. So that is a really affordable way of getting Creative Cloud on your computers. I'm going to open up from the desktop this diagram that we just saved in the previous tutorial, and it should come in at this 1/16 inch scale, right? Now the scale's not super important, but what is important is that the line weights kind of look and feel about right. For those of you that aren't familiar with Illustrator, the important thing to remember is that it's a very effective tool. There's a couple of it's a very effective software. There's a couple tools that will be more helpful to you than others. But really this purpose of this tutorial is just to give you a chance to kind of notate the drawing, right? So if you're doing architectural construction documents, you're doing these drawings based on notations and details. There's a style, right, of how that typically works. You can do that in Revit. You can do it in SketchUp's version of layout, right? Those are both great tools for doing that in. But you can also kind of do it a little bit in Illustrator. And more importantly, as you become more familiar in customizing that, it becomes more inherently your own style. So we're asking you guys in this process to kind of have a little bit more specific style with how you'd like to draft this. Now, I'm giving you one example, but do not feel compelled to do exactly what I'm doing. Just realize that this is kind of the building blocks upon which you can introduce some other elements that you might find effective. The hope is, though, is that we can present diagrams to the class, to ASPPH, to those are the people funding this kind of collaboration between us and public health, that start to look at why design and health matter, right? So one of the things that I've drawn, and this is an approximation of Rio Bravo, which is a grocery store in Kansas City, Kansas, is this produce section in the back, right? And that's pretty far removed from the front of the store. If I was being more literal, there'd be a lot more stuff in between here and the back of the store. But that's also a really tight area. In reality, it's probably a lot less than I've shown it. But you start to have that conversation. So the first thing I'm going to do is just kind of set up the artboard. Realize that you'll probably present this on a screen. And one way to get that done effectively is to go to your artboard tab. So I clicked on this artboard tab. It brings me up this frame. There's a lot of different ways you can do that. I don't really know which one will be best for you, but I can say definitively that if you do 1280 by 800, that's what most computer screens work with. If you'd like to keep it where it's at, that's probably fine. Just realize that this is kind of the proportion that you'll end up with. You can set that, right? So you can set your monitor size, 1440 by 900. Like that might be what it looks like on your monitor. But in reality, it's really what you want it to be. Another way to do it simply is just to do fit to artwork bounds. That's another way to effectively get everything that's in your drawing onto the page. You can also move them manually, and that's fine. But what I would just make sure you do is whatever you do, don't make it too small. You can make it maybe a little too large, and that I don't think that'll be a problem for this exercise. But making it too small, you're going to lose some resolution, right? So the reason we did Adobe PDF is because there's something about having lines as vectors that's really nice. So, for example, I can move it around. If I made a mistake, maybe I want to get rid of this little guy, I can actually select them and delete them. That's a nice little feature. So though I'm not in SketchUp, I can work with it. You guys should all be familiar with this by now as architecture students. The other nice thing I can do is I can select all of it, and I can change the line weights on the fly. So I'm going to make them pretty thin to start, which is a nice, easy way of doing that. I might also select them all by hitting this little tab right here, and I might go into, there's a stroke panel. It might be other places on your machine, but you can also kind of set this up. So you see these hard edges. You might say, well, I want them to extend past the edge, like it does there, or I might want to round them a little bit so that it's a little bit more clean and continuous. So let's do that because that looks good. So now we have this kind of basic diagram. We want to find ways to annotate this, right? So there might be certain details that your public health classmates pulled out or that you noticed in your kind of observations in your documentation that you want to draw attention to. And that's what the goal of using Illustrator is. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to label this line work, so it's self-evident, and I'm going to lock it because there's nothing I really want to do on it just yet. The next thing I want to do is start looking at, okay, there might be some noted things I want to talk about. So, for example, maybe there's something in this area of the store that I want to draw attention to. Maybe it's this specific shelf item. And I'm going to use what's called the pen tool. And the pen tool is like the best tool possible for Illustrator. And it's going to be your most customizable tool for what you're going to be doing. So I'm going to click once, click again, and I'm going to drag it out. So this is going to start to feel a little bit like a set of construction documents for a good reason, right? Because we want you guys to enjoy kind of this process and learn something along the way. So think of this as a construction document exercise in a small measure, just with a little bit more creativity involved. So when I'm in this stroke tab, sometimes it just shows you this. To get the extra layer, hit show options. And once you do, there's a whole bunch more stuff that you can work with. So selecting that line, I'm going to add an arrow. And it doesn't really matter which area you use, but architecturally we typically tend to use arrows that look a little like this. And you can change the scale of it, a little bit, so make it a little bit bigger and more prominent. Maybe 200 is probably about right. So it clearly kind of jumps off the page at you a little. And because the fonts and everything are a little funny because we're not really typically working with a letter page, the important thing is to just realize this needs to be legible, right? So if this is on a screen like it is now, what font is going to be legible? InDesign's great for doing that, but it's not that critical that you're taking this to InDesign. So let's just work with Illustrator. And I'm going to go into, pick a font that's one of my favorites. You might have your own favorite, and that's fine. But Franklin Gothic Book is a pretty good looking font, and I'll make the font large enough. So when we talk about, let's say vegetables, and say this is a part of the description that you guys want to bring to attention. And you could say maybe there's another row and it's a little bit more, whoops. So we found, and this font could be a little smaller because maybe it's more context specific. Found these items at this location. And maybe for this one you want to be more bold because you really want this thing to pop off the page. So that starts to get to this kind of relationship. Now if you want to modify this, what's cool is that the pen tool, there's this anchor thing. So if I click this, I can't really do much with it. Now if I hold the control key on my keyboard and I double click it, then I can do a lot more. So I double click it and I'm going to drag it around and I'm going to pull it over, and now it kind of creates this nice little spot for me to maybe use that. Maybe that's how I want to do it. I can cut that line and I'm going to take the arrowhead off. Maybe that's how I want to, draw attention to this thing. That could be one way of doing it. And what's nice is now you can start to do that in multiple scenarios, right? So now you say, okay, this is another instance where you found something. Peanut butter. That's something you want to say. You want to draw attention to, whatever that might be. This is one way of getting the screen to start to highlight some of the issues that we're talking about. And why is that important? Well, for example, if we go to the line work, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a little bit of a line here to here. I'm going to make sure it's its own line by cutting it, and I'm going to make it invisible. The little red slash is invisible. So now there's an invisible line there. And I'm going to do another invisible line, say kind of here. You could say I could have drawn this in SketchUp, and I certainly could have. But what I want to do is I want to make this a live art file. So Object, Live Paint, Make. And what that's going to let me do is something kind of cool. I hit the K button. It's also this button down here, Live Paint Bucket. And now everything's paintable. So if I go into, say, my color swatches, like the options, you can do this. So this is the Swatches tab. I'm going to hit this top right corner, which is the Options, Open Swatch Library, and now you can get into all kinds of interesting color tones and color patterns. There's a lot of different ways to do that, but for right now, I'll just pick an appropriate one. Foods. Whoops. So, Open Swatch Library, Foods. I can't keep it going. I opened Earth Tones by accident. I'm having trouble selecting it. Open Swatch Library, Foods, Vegetables. So now I have this kind of color palette, and I can use any of these colors to highlight what I want to highlight. So let's use like a bright orange or yellow orange. And that might draw some attention to this part of the drawing. Maybe I, say there's this kind of consistency, right, where there's these colors and you see them under a certain kind of style. Be creative here, do how you want, but you can start to even, shade it a little bit. And by shading it, you're kind of adding depth to the overall drawing. Oops. And so now by using the paint bucket tool with that live paint, I've actually really clearly said this is an area to pay attention to. So now if I take what I've done and I pull this over, and I'm going to hit reflect on this. I'll reflect it on the horizontal axis. Oops, no. Sorry, I need to reflect it on the vertical axis. I pull this back over here. Now I can start calling this out and say this is part of the area. Likewise, I might want to take this thing down here and say this is the entrance. Likewise, I might want to take, and again, it's helpful to lock down the layers. One thing you might also want to do is things like text. It's helpful to put it on its own layer, right? So I'm going to create a new layer with these things selected. If I drag what's selected, I can drag it to the new layer. So now I have my text on one layer, and I have my line work, added line work on another. So arrows for that one, text for this one. This will just keep your life a little bit easier when you're managing the file. So now I have entrance, and maybe I do one more, and it's bus stop. And you say, this is maybe it's the 101 route. Maybe it's, I think it's going westbound. And if I pull this over here, maybe it's something over on this area. I'll delete that one, I'll pull this one down. And really, what's nice about it is if you're careful, you can kind of keep everything in a line. All right, that shows you that you're thinking graphically about the alignment of everything. So now this could be just as simple as saying parking lot. So pretty quickly, you're showing us what is at the store. And I think you can draw from what your public health classmates have done and what you guys have hopefully cataloged and will be able to catalog as what's in the store that we need to be paying attention to. How is lighting affected? If you want to get creative and say, there's natural lighting, right? So you could say there's an aspect of natural light that we're gonna try to give these things a color tone. If I open up another good one to use is you could find it really anything. The easiest one to do is the color books, really. And that's where you get Pantone Colors, which is kind of the standard for a lot of color selection. So now you could say, let's get a kind of a light source And we'll give it a dotted line. Maybe select and say this is something that's overhead, right? Because dashed lines represent overhead line work in architectural drawings. So maybe that is a way of saying that there's, you know, certain light sources that you want to draw attention to. Change the line weight, make it a little thinner. And you got to edit the dash. It's a little small menu, but if you do that carefully enough, you can get the and say, you know, maybe there's lights that are there, and you're using the Alt key, and you can drag them and drop them pretty quickly. Another way to do that, by the way, if you're trying to keep that more effective and you kind of got a sense of where those go, you can select down here. And if I select these two things, I can do Object, Blend, Make, and it creates this kind of array. If you're needing to specify, hit Blend Options, and there's a specified step, so maybe there's 5 lights there. And I go back and do the blend again. Now there's only 5 lights. So that's an effective way of saying I'm going to quickly mock up where maybe the light source is. And there's different ways of diagramming that out. There's different ways of doing that. Feel free to be creative in that respect. There might be, you know, other parts of the drawing too that you get outside of it and you're like, you know, I really want to show off that this is a bus stop. So let's use a color book, color property. Right there, and this is color, and then maybe underneath it, right? So now when you're working with layers creatively, you can go underneath it, and let's make a layer below, and I'll just kind of say, you know, this is a bus stop zone, maybe, and that's something that, you know, I don't want to change the color necessarily, I'll just change the opacity. I'll change it to 20%. Whoops, that didn't do anything. Let me change this one. And maybe I don't want that work there. Well, you know, that might be nice, but you now realize that it's coloring the base of that thing. So I'll unlock and I'll just paint this thing in. So now that's a bus stop, and it starts to feel like there's something about that specific area. The other thing you might be interested in doing too, and this could be helpful for you, is to start thinking about, okay, what's the pathway, right? So what would be a pathway of arrival? So maybe it's, you know, you might be able to drop a diagram of a car in there. You might be able to do a lot of different ways of doing this, but you say, you know, okay, one way is it's this kind of route. If you hold down the control button, you can get these leader arrows, and this is how you do curves really well in Illustrator. This is why Illustrator is so powerful, is the curve tool on the pen is great. So now I can start to, you know, maybe draw more of a natural pathway. So now it's you're walking through the aisles. You know, if you guys are really creative, you could even draw kind of a summary of your route, of what you experienced, how'd you shop through the environment, check out, and you go. So now if you're to do that, you might say, well, I don't want this thing to be blocking my building, so real quick I'm going to just, you know, paint this thing, and maybe because it's a building surface and I don't want the building surface to contradict with the rest of the drawing, I'm going to paint it like a light gray. So now quickly that kind of pops off the page, right? Maybe it's a little bit lighter gray in there. Well, that doesn't really show, does it? So let's go back to this gray, and this is just kind of the process, right? You kind of go through it, you figure out what works for you, what doesn't work for you, but try to make this thing as clear as possible so people can get a sense of it. So I'm kind of adding depth right now, making it kind of a two-tone effect happen. Maybe I want to make this black. Oops. To poche those walls, you know, because we're cutting through them. Okay, so that starts to work, right? So now the building's starting to read a little bit better. You know, if maybe some of this pathway, you're thinking, well, I don't really want it to intersect with that light quite like that, so I'm going to pull this guy out a little bit more. So those anchor points, when you hold control, you have to hold control to do this. Those anchor points become a really nice way of modifying the line. Now, if you use this cut tool over here, it's a C button on your keyboard, you can cut that line. And what's nice is once you cut it, let's see, I didn't cut that carefully enough. Do it again and delete it. So now it's like it's being hidden, right? So one way I hid it was by painting over it. The other way I hide it is by cutting it and just literally deleting part of that segment of the line. I'll delete it there. So it just makes things a little bit more clear. And less complicated. Now, obviously, these kind of lines might not be the most effective way of showing it, so let's go to our layer, pull this up, and we're missing something right there, right? So this maybe needs to be above there, and that doesn't work, does it? So the one thing we could do is pull this back up and just make sure that these lines don't cross paths. There's another way you could do that and just have multiple line work layers on top of each other and one set to multiply, right? So this region could have been set to multiply. That way it doesn't, deal with it too badly. I'll show you what that would look like if we took the, let's see. So these guys, let's do another layer. So I made a new layer. I'm going to pull them into it. Call them lights. This one, let's call this path. So maybe the lights are there. What I can do is I can select everything on that layer, go to my effects, opacity, and hit multiply. So just like in Photoshop or something, now it's a multiply layer. Anything that goes over, it's going to show what's underneath it, and that could be an effective way to get that across. So now with this line work, we'll just wrap it up and say, if there's a dash line, there's a dash line, and maybe you want to bring it, you can add arrows to it. So, oops. So this is the starting arrow, and you just kind of have to work with it and figure out what works. I'd be careful not to make it look too much like the leader arrows. So you might say that this needs to be a different color. That could be one way of doing it. So let's set the color to this thing. Maybe it's more of a red. Oops, that's something different. Let's go in and really select all these. So let's just start with this one. That's why. I accidentally set the fill and not the color. So let's set, or I'm sorry, the fill and not the stroke. You kind of have to be aware of that. And I was not. So let's open up our Swatch library and see if we can do this better. Color books, Pantone. That's more of a pink, but that works for now. Let's just use that. So now there's kind of this red path of what you took. Ideally, what you're doing is that these images can help you tell a story, right? These images can help you describe to your classmates where you went, what you did. Can help us understand why, there might be a design solution in this, right? Like you might eventually propose that this part of the store could be reconfigured somewhere else. So there might be a better way of putting some sort of kiosk for fresh produce at this point that you've crossed multiple times, or little elements like that can make a big difference in how you guys are seeing it. But it starts by having you guys kind of document what you've done. So I would encourage you guys to take that time and really kind of make these drawings alive with what you guys researched, what you saw, what you observed, and how can that be very clearly represented, right? So giving it some hierarchy, telling us, just like you would with line weights, what's the important thing. So using color to pop and say, this is an important part of the area. All of that helps build a narrative that becomes really effective. So work on that. If you have any questions, feel free to email Shannon or I. We'd be happy to talk to you about it. But this is kind of the end of that process with the grocery store diagrams. and there will be a couple more related to the parks. All right, thank you.